This may look like a sleepy little seaside town somewhere in the British Isles. In fact, the United Kingdom is 8,000 miles away. These are the Falkland Islands, a remote British territory in the South Atlantic. The nearest mainland is Argentina, just 400 miles to the west. Life for the 2,500 people who live here is isolated, hardy and undisturbed. But in April 1982, all that changed, when these islands became the setting for the last invasion of British territory.
On April 2nd, 1982, about 100 Argentinian Marines landed here on the Falklands. Their objective? To capture the capital, Stanley. They were the advance party. There were 2,000 more men on their way, but the job of these Marines was to seize the town and force the British governor of the islands to surrender. Soon, the extraordinary news of the Argentinian invasion hit bulletins across the world.
The Falkland Islands, the British colony in the South Atlantic, has fallen, but that's what Argentina is saying. It claims its Marines went ashore as a spearhead this morning to capture key targets, including the capital, Port Stanley.
The islands were defended by just 69 Royal Marines, and the invading Argentinians in their hundreds overwhelmed this tiny force. They moved up here and surrounded Government House, demanding the surrender of the Falkland Islands. As Argentinian armoured vehicles rolled towards Government House, a firefight broke out. Trapped inside, the British governor, Rex Hunt, broadcast a defiant message on the local radio station.
They've got us well and truly pinned down, and that they're not trying to attack. They're not surrendering to the bloody arches, certainly not.
The invasion of the Falklands transformed a long-running dispute between Britain and Argentina into a major international crisis.
For 2 centuries, both countries have claimed the Falklands. The Argentinians did control the islands for nearly a decade, until 1833, when the British expelled them. Britain has governed the Falklands ever since. The Argentinians call the islands the Malvinas, and they tried to persuade the British to give them up. Britain had long considered handing over this small relic of empire to Argentina, but the Falkland Islanders liked their British identity and didn't want to give it up. It became clear to the British government that overriding the wishes of the islanders was out of the question. The people here wanted the islands to stay British sovereign territory. This made agreement between Britain and Argentina almost impossible. Talks got nowhere, and the future of the Falkland Islands remained in an uneasy deadlock. But in 1981, a new military government seized power in Argentina. At its head was the army commander, General Leopoldo Galtieri. His regime was a rule of terror, and the country's economy was collapsing. He badly needed to find a cause that would win his government popularity. There was one issue Galtieri knew his people cared passionately about: their claim to the Falkland Islands. Galtieri would unite the Argentinian nation by seizing the Falkland Islands from Britain by force. It looked like the perfect answer to his problems. And on April the 2nd, 1982, Galtieri's repossession of the Falklands was going exactly to plan.
Within hours of landing, hundreds of Argentinian troops were all over Stanley. They had even seized the radio station.
Just a minute. If you take the gun out of my back, I'm going to transmit it to you. If you take the gun away.
The governor, Rex Hunt, had little choice but to surrender. He broadcast a final message to the islanders from Government House.
It's probably the last message I'll be able to give you. I wish you all the best of luck, and rest assured that the British will be back.
The governor and the Royal Marines were escorted off the islands and sent back to Britain. The civilians were left wondering what would happen next.
We heard these tremendous bangs on the back door and there were shouts for us to come out. We had to go out and sit in the yard. And this Argentine was there with a machine gun trained on us. Mum thought we were going to be shot.
8,000 miles from Britain, the islanders were left unprotected and isolated.
When the news of the British surrender hit Buenos Aires that afternoon, 200,000 Argentinians poured into the main square, wildly applauding the liberation of the Islas Malvinas. Galtieri's plan had worked. As the crowd celebrated, Galtieri was confident that Britain would not react. He assumed that because the distant Falklands was hardly a vital British interest, Britain would not fight for them. But Galtieri was making one crucial error. He'd seriously underestimated Britain's Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher. In 1982, Britain's first female Prime Minister was governing a country in trouble. Britain was in recession. Unemployment had just passed the 3 million mark, and there'd been some of the worst rioting of the 20th century. But Thatcher was a formidable character. She knew that to hesitate could spell doom for her unpopular government. She summoned Parliament and gave a defiant response to Argentina's invasion.
We are here because for the first time for many years, British sovereign territory has been invaded by a foreign power. The government has now decided that a large task force will sail as soon as all preparations are complete. HMS Invincible will be in the lead and will leave port on Monday.
And so, in the spring of 1982, a British task force set sail. Ahead lay an 8,000-mile journey across the Atlantic Ocean to the Falkland Islands. In all, 93 ships would sail to the Falklands, a hastily gathered fleet of warships, supply ships, and even cruise liners like the QE2. At the heart of the fleet were two aircraft carriers, HMS Invincible and HMS Hermes. Hermes was the flagship and home to the task force commander, Rear Admiral Sandy Woodward. Woodward's fleet would take 3 weeks to reach the Falklands. During that time, Britain would try for a diplomatic solution. But if that failed, the task force would have to go to war when it got there. By April the 17th, the first wave of the task force had sailed right down into the South Atlantic and was just off Ascension Island, the nearest British base to the Falklands. There was still another 3,500 miles to the Falkland Islands themselves. The ships were in two groups. To the south was Woodward's naval fleet. This was the advance party, made up of two aircraft carriers and fighting ships that would battle for the control of the air and the sea around the Falkland Islands. Once they had gained air superiority, then the men carried in the second group of ships would launch an amphibious landing. The only way to win back the Falklands would be to have troops fighting on the ground there. As the fleet sailed south, United Nations and US diplomats tried for a peaceful settlement. But by April the 30th, any hope of a diplomatic solution evaporated. Neither side would back down. Neither Britain nor Argentina had officially declared war, but now war seemed inevitable.
The Argentinian garrison of these islands watched the British military response to their invasion with growing concern. The race was now on to get organised and resupplied before the British arrived. The Argentinian army did have some professional soldiers, but the majority of its men were young conscripts. To strengthen its forces, the army recalled reservists, more experienced men who could stiffen the ranks of those who'd just begun their military service.
My commanding officer came on the radio at 4 o'clock in the morning and told me to wake up all the men. We had to be in the Malvinas in 36 hours. You could see that the soldiers felt very proud.
By the end of April, there were 13,000 Argentinian troops on the islands, and with them, their new commander.
The man in charge was Brigadier General Mario Menendez. Menendez was a tough soldier who'd made his name fighting rebels in remote parts of Argentina. He was quickly sworn in as the new governor of the Falklands. His first task was to prepare his defences. Strategically, Menendez's position was strong. As you can see, the Falkland Islands are about 400 miles from Argentina. That put the islands just within range of Argentina's air force based on the mainland. The main two islands are West and East Falkland, each around 50 miles from end to end. Menendez positioned 2,000 of his men on West Falkland, 1,000 men here at Goose Green, and about 10,000 in the hills to the west of Stanley. These hills were the Argentinians' last line of defense. But Menendez hoped his ground troops wouldn't have to fight at all. He planned to neutralize the British task force out at sea before they had a chance to set foot on land.
The Argentinian Air Force was well trained and could launch high-performance fighter bombers from bases on the mainland. These aircraft could attack the task force once they were within range. Against this force, the British could only take as many fighters as they could fit onto their two aircraft carriers. That was just 34 planes. 34 against nearly 100 Argentinian fighters. This small force was supposed to gain air superiority, protect the British fleet, and prepare the way for the amphibians.